A source very close to the Nancy Guthrie investigation is sitting down with me. We had to conceal this person's identity. Obviously, the person can get in big trouble for speaking out, but they wanted to talk about issues early on in the Nancy Guthrie investigation that may have impacted things. Also, a message for Savannah Guthrie, and issues within the Pima County Sheriff's Office and issues with the sheriff who's overseeing the Nancy Guthrie investigation.
For nearly 4 months, America watched the front porch. The blood on the concrete, the ripped-off Ring camera, the masked figure standing in the dark with a flashlight clenched between his teeth. Every major network replayed those images like they contained the answer. But according to Brian Entin's latest reporting, the most important part of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance may have never been at the front of the house at all. It was at the back. Because while the country was studying the porch, investigators were quietly trying to understand why multiple rear doors inside Nancy Guthrie's Catalina Foothills home were allegedly found propped open in the middle of the night. Not forced open. Not broken open. And the deeper FBI profilers dug into that single detail, the more disturbing the picture became. A woman vanishes from one of the wealthiest and quietest neighborhoods in Arizona. Blood is found outside her home. Her Ring camera is ripped away. There are no major signs of a violent struggle inside. And somehow, whoever moved through that property appeared to know exactly where everything was. The doors, the pathways, the garden, even the flower pots allegedly used to hold the exits open. That is the detail investigators have never fully explained publicly. Because according to behavioral experts, people do not move through a stranger's property like that in total darkness unless they have done it before. And now, after months of forensic testing, FBI analysis, sealed evidence, and a SWAT operation that still raises more questions than answers, investigators appear to be building toward one deeply uncomfortable possibility. Nancy Guthrie may have opened that door for someone she trusted. Tonight, we are going to walk through the evidence piece by piece. The forensic details, the behavioral analysis, the hidden contradictions, the crime scene clues the public overlooked, and the disturbing reason experts increasingly believe this case points toward one very specific type of person. Because the deeper Brian Entin dug into what the FBI allegedly found inside that house, the clearer one terrifying possibility became. This may never have been a random intruder. And if you've been following this case closely, subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because every week new details continue surfacing that completely reshape what investigators may actually be looking at. And while you're watching, tell us where you're watching from down in the comments. One of the most remarkable things about cases like this is seeing people from all over the world trying to piece together the same mystery together in real time. Because tonight we are going far deeper than the headlines ever did. And the deeper this story goes, the harder it becomes to ignore what the evidence may be saying. 4 months, the entire story of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance has been seen through one image. The front of her house. That's where the camera was. That's where the footage came from. That's where the blood was later found on the porch. That's the scene that played over and over again on television. A dark figure outside. A flashlight. A quick moment of movement. Then nothing. Naturally, that became the center of the investigation in the public's mind. But according to investigative reporting from Brian Entin, and details later mentioned in televised interviews involving Nancy Guthrie's family, there is something else about that night that never got the same attention. Something at the back of the house. While everyone was focused on the front door, investigators were looking at the rear of the property. And what they noticed there didn't fit the normal pattern of a break-in. The back doors were not reported as being broken down. There was no clear sign they were forced open. Instead, they were described in a way that stood out to investigators. They were propped open. Not cracked open. Not damaged. Not hanging off the hinges. Propped. That one detail changes how you look at everything. Because a forced door tells you someone broke in. But a propped door tells you something else entirely. It suggests time, control, and intention. It suggests someone didn't just enter the space, they managed it. And even more strange, reports connected to the scene mentioned that objects from the property itself may have been used to keep those doors in place. Things like flower pots from the garden area were allegedly involved in holding the rear access points open. That might sound small at first, almost meaningless. But in investigations like this, small details are often the ones that matter most. Because most people breaking into a house at night are focused on one thing: getting in and getting out as fast as possible. They don't usually stop to carefully arrange doors or keep multiple exits open in a controlled way. That kind of behavior makes investigators pause. It suggests something more planned, something more familiar, something that doesn't look random. And that's where things start to feel off. Because inside the house, according to reporting around the investigation, there wasn't the kind of chaos you would expect from a violent forced entry. No obvious destruction. No clear sign of a long struggle inside the rooms. Instead, the strongest signs of something wrong were outside the home, at the front porch, and at the back exits. Almost like whatever happened didn't begin deep inside the house. It started at the edges, at the doors, at the points where someone either came in or was let in. And once you start looking at it that way, the question changes. It's no longer just about how someone got inside. It becomes about who had enough knowledge of that house to move through it in a way that left so little obvious damage behind. Because that is the part investigators keep circling back to. Not just what happened that night, but how controlled it all seemed. And that kind of control usually points to something investigators take very seriously. Familiarity. The last normal moments of Nancy Guthrie's life don't look like anything unusual at first. It was an ordinary evening in the Catalina foothills. A quiet neighborhood, calm streets, the kind of place where nothing feels like it could go wrong. Nancy had spent time with family earlier in the day. Nothing about it stood out. No warning, no tension. Just a routine day that ended the way most days do, heading back home. At some point that night, she returned to her house alone. She pulled into the garage. The door closed behind her. And just like any other night, she stepped back into the quiet of her home. This is where everything becomes important, because investigators later began reconstructing what likely happened inside those final hours. Nancy had a routine. Like many older adults, especially those living alone, she followed a pattern at night. She settled in. She prepared for bed. She removed her hearing aids before sleeping, something she did regularly because she didn't need them at night. That small detail matters more than it seems, because it meant that once she was in bed, she was cut off from almost everything around her. No sound from outside would reach her easily. No warning noise would be clear. The house would feel even quieter than usual. And in a neighborhood already known for being peaceful, that silence would have felt normal. Until it wasn't. Sometime during the night, something happened outside her home that changed everything inside it. Investigators later identified signs of activity in the early morning hours. There were references in reporting to motion events and disturbances around the property. But the exact sequence is still something pieced together carefully, not fully confirmed in public detail. What is known is what was found afterward. When family members later went to check on Nancy, they didn't walk into a scene that immediately explained itself. There was blood outside the home. Not inside in a clear, obvious way that would tell the full story. Outside, near the entrance area, where something violent had clearly happened. But inside the house, something didn't match that level of violence. It didn't look like a place that had been torn apart in a struggle. It didn't look like someone had forced their way through every room in panic or resistance. Instead, it looked wrong in a quieter way. Like the most important moment didn't happen inside the house at all. It happened right at the edge of it, at the door. That's where investigators began focusing their attention. Because if someone had broken in violently, the inside of the home would usually show it. Furniture moved. Signs of struggle. Chaos that tells a clear story. But that wasn't the picture being described in early reporting. Instead, the strongest evidence pointed outward. Toward the porch. Toward the entry points. Toward the moment someone crossed from outside into Nancy's space. And that raises the question investigators still haven't fully answered in public. Did Nancy hear something that night? Did she get up? Did she go toward the door because she recognized something, or someone? Because for someone her age, living alone in a quiet neighborhood, the most dangerous moment isn't usually inside the house. It's the moment the door is opened. And once that door opens, everything that happens after becomes much harder to explain. That is where the timeline begins to blur. That is where control seems to shift away from the house itself. And that is where investigators believe the real story of that night may have started. For a long time, the focus stayed on the same things. The front porch, the blood, the camera footage. But as investigators kept reviewing the scene, a smaller detail started to stand out. One that didn't get as much attention at first, but slowly became harder to ignore. The back of the house. According to reporting connected to Brian Entin's coverage and comments made publicly by members of Nancy Guthrie's family during interviews, the rear part of the property didn't match what most people expected from a sudden, violent disappearance. It wasn't just about what was open. It was how it was open. Multiple access points at the back of the home were described as being in a propped position. Not damaged, not kicked in, not broken, just held open. That might not sound like much at first, but in a case like this, the difference is everything. Because forced entry is loud. It leaves signs. It creates chaos. But something being propped open suggests control. It suggests someone had time to adjust things, to move through the space without rushing, to keep certain paths available. Even more unusual, reporting around the case mentioned that items from the property itself may have been used in that process. Objects like flower pots from the garden area were reportedly connected to how those rear access points were kept in place. That detail changed how some investigators looked at the scene, because it's one thing to break into a home. It's something else entirely to use what's already inside the property to manage how you move through it. It suggests familiarity, not just with the house itself but with the outside space too. The garden, the layout, the small details most people wouldn't think twice about. And that's where things start to feel less random. Behavioral experts who have commented on similar types of crime scenes often point out that most intruders don't take time to organize a space. They don't stabilize exits. They don't carefully maintain multiple routes unless there is a reason to go back and forth. But here, the suggestion is that movement through the property wasn't a single moment. It may have involved more than one pass, in and out, or movement that required keeping those exits open for a purpose investigators still haven't fully explained publicly. At the same time, what's missing is just as important. Inside the house, there hasn't been widespread reporting of major destruction or a clear, obvious struggle that would normally define a forced break-in. Instead, the strongest signs of disturbance remain outside the home, at the front entrance, and at the back exits. Almost like the house itself wasn't where everything happened. It was just the space between what happened outside and what happened next. That's what makes this detail so important. Because once you remove the idea of a chaotic break-in inside the home, the picture shifts. You start looking at the edges instead of the center. The doors, the entry points, the paths someone used to move through the property. And once investigators began looking at it that way, one question became unavoidable. Who would move through a stranger's home with that kind of control in the middle of the night? Because that doesn't look like panic. It doesn't look like randomness. It looks like someone who already understood the space they were in. And that possibility changes everything about how this case is understood. When investigators first step inside a home like this, they are usually looking for chaos, signs of forced entry, broken furniture, a trail of struggle that tells them exactly where something began and how it unfolded. But in Nancy Guthrie's case, according to early reporting and statements discussed in media coverage, that kind of clear interior destruction was not what stood out most. Instead, what stood out was what wasn't there. Inside the house, there were no widely reported signs of a long, violent struggle moving from room to room. No obvious trail of destruction that showed someone fighting for their life deep inside the home. That absence became one of the most important parts of the investigation. Because in cases like this, silence in a crime scene can be just as loud as evidence. Outside the home, however, the story looked very different. That is where the blood was reportedly found. Near the front porch area where something clearly went wrong. And that contrast immediately created a problem for investigators. Because normally, if someone breaks into a home and violence happens inside, you expect to see signs of it throughout the interior space. But here, the strongest physical evidence was outside, at the edge of the house, not deep inside it. That raised a difficult question early on. Did something happen before Nancy ever fully got back into her home? Or did she come back outside at some point after being inside? Or did she never really get the chance to fully settle into the safety of her home that night? Adding to that uncertainty was another detail that kept coming up in reporting around the case. The condition of the entry points. The rear doors and exits were described as being in a propped position, not damaged or broken. And inside, there were no clear signs that someone had violently forced their way through the house in the traditional sense. That combination is what made the case so unusual. Because investigators are trained to read patterns. And this pattern didn't behave like a typical burglary or random break-in. It didn't show a clear inside-to-outside struggle. Instead, it looked like something that may have unfolded around the threshold of the home itself. The front entrance. The porch. The points where someone crosses from outside into private space. That's where everything seems to concentrate. And when you focus on that threshold, another possibility begins to form. If there was no major internal struggle, then the key moment may not have happened deeper inside the house. It may have happened right at the door. That is the point where trust becomes important. Because doors are not just physical barriers. They are decisions. Someone has to choose to open them. And according to behavioral experts who have commented on similar cases, when there is limited evidence of forced entry and a victim is found outside or near entry points, investigators often consider whether the person inside may have voluntarily approached or opened the door. Not because they expected danger, but because they believed they recognized what was on the other side. That idea becomes even more important when you combine it with what else is known. The calm neighborhood, the nighttime silence, the routine nature of Nancy's life, the fact that she lived alone and followed predictable patterns in her evening routine. All of those details matter, because they shape how someone responds to a knock, a voice, or movement outside their home. And once that door opens, everything changes. At that point, control shifts, and whatever happens next is no longer happening at a distance. It is happening face to face. That is why investigators began paying closer attention to what was outside the house rather than what was inside it. Because the inside doesn't always tell the beginning of the story. Sometimes, it only shows what was left behind after the important moment already happened somewhere else. And in this case, that moment appears to be connected to the exact place where inside becomes outside. The door. The threshold. The point where everything changed. At this stage of the investigation, the question is no longer just what happened that night. It becomes who could make it happen in a way that left so few clear answers behind. That is where behavioral analysis begins to take over. Because when physical evidence doesn't fully explain a scene, investigators turn to behavior. And in this case, the behavior being studied is what happened at the front of Nancy Guthrie's home. The Ring camera footage. The movement outside the door. The timing. The stillness. The lack of immediate forced entry. Former FBI behavioral experts who have reviewed similar types of incidents often focus on one key question. Did the person outside the door behave like a stranger, or like someone who expected a response? Because there is a difference. A stranger trying to break in is usually chaotic, fast, uncontrolled, panicked or aggressive. They don't wait long. But in this case, the behavior being discussed publicly in media analysis suggests something different. Patience, waiting, positioning, and most importantly, confidence that someone inside might respond. That alone changes the direction of the profile, because it suggests the person outside the door wasn't guessing. They were expecting a reaction. Investigators and behavioral specialists who have appeared in media discussions around the case have also pointed out something else. The way the space was used. The porch. The doorway. The positioning of the individual captured on camera. Subscribe right now and tell us where you're watching from down in the comments. At a certain point in this investigation, the case stopped looking like just a missing person report. Something shifted. And that shift became most visible during a federal operation in Rio Rico, Arizona. According to reporting from Brian Entin, law enforcement carried out a SWAT-level action tied directly to the investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. It wasn't a small visit or a routine check. It was a coordinated, high-intensity operation built around a federal search warrant. That alone tells you something important. Search warrants at that level are not issued casually. A judge has to approve them. Investigators have to present enough probable cause to justify sending tactical teams into a location. So even before anything was found or not found, the decision to act at that level suggests investigators believed there was a real possibility of evidence connected to the case in that area. The operation unfolded in Rio Rico, a quiet community not far from the broader investigative region. According to Entin's coverage, multiple individuals were detained during the operation. At least one traffic stop was also tied into the wider action, suggesting investigators were following a connected chain of leads rather than a single fixed location. But what stood out just as much as the detentions was what didn't happen afterward. There were no immediate public arrests tied directly to the SWAT operation. That created another layer of mystery. Because when law enforcement goes in with that level of force, the public usually expects a quick and clear outcome. Charges, arrest, confirmed suspects. Instead, what followed was silence. That silence became part of the story. Sheriff Chris Nanos, speaking through public updates referenced in media coverage, confirmed that the investigation was still active and ongoing, but did not publicly reveal the specific details that led to the operation. And that gap between action and explanation is where speculation begins to grow. Because investigators don't launch federal operations without a reason. Something led them there. Something specific enough to convince them that action could not wait. But that something has not been fully shared with the public. And that leaves only one thing to analyze: timing. The operation happened weeks into an already developing investigation. That means investigators had already gathered enough information to move beyond observation and into direct intervention. That suggests they were no longer just looking for general answers. They were looking for something or someone in particular. This is where the investigation starts to feel less like a wide search and more like a narrowing path. At the same time, it reinforces something already seen in the earlier stages of the case: control. Because whether it is the prop doors at the back of the house, the controlled behavior at the front porch, or the coordinated movement implied by the investigation, everything points toward planning rather than randomness. And the Rio Rico operation fits into that same pattern. It suggests investigators were tracing a line that may have connected people, places, or actions that were not obvious at first glance. Even though the public was not given the full picture of what was found or confirmed during the operation, the fact that it happened at all changes how the case is understood, because it confirms something important. This was not a passive investigation. It was active. And at some point, it escalated enough for federal-level intervention. Which brings the case back to a central question. What exactly were investigators trying to find in Rio Rico that they believed was connected to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance? The answer has not been made public. But the intensity of the operation suggests they believed it mattered. And in investigations like this, where action is based on intelligence rather than speculation, that alone is significant enough to keep following the trail. By this point in the investigation, the story is no longer only about doors, cameras, or movement outside the house. It has moved into something slower, something quieter, something that doesn't make headlines in the same way, but often decides the outcome of cases like this. Forensics. Inside Nancy Guthrie's home, investigators reportedly collected biological evidence that would later be sent for laboratory testing. Among the most widely discussed details in media reporting was the recovery of a hair sample. But not just any hair sample. It was described as rootless. That detail matters more than most people realize. Because a rootless hair limits what investigators can immediately extract in terms of direct nuclear DNA. Instead, what remains is mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited through maternal lines and shared among relatives. It doesn't usually give a direct name, but it can point investigators in a direction, or rule people out, and that alone makes it valuable. The sample was reportedly sent to federal forensic laboratories, including analysis tied to FBI-supported facilities in Quantico, where evidence from complex cases is often processed and compared against known databases. But the hair was only part of a larger picture. According to statements attributed to law enforcement officials and media coverage, there was also mention of mixed DNA evidence being recovered from the scene. That phrase changes everything. Because mixed DNA means more than one person's genetic material is present in a single sample. And depending on how complex that mixture is, separating it cleanly can become extremely difficult. Sometimes even impossible with older methods. If there are multiple contributors, the evidence doesn't immediately point to one person. Instead, it creates a puzzle. Pieces that must be separated carefully before they mean anything in court. This is where modern forensic genealogy comes in. In recent years, investigators have increasingly turned to advanced DNA reconstruction techniques that can take partial or degraded samples and compare them against large genealogical databases. This is the same general approach used in several major cold cases that were eventually solved years after the original crimes. But it is not fast, and it is not always straightforward. It requires time, comparison, and careful validation before it can be used in an official investigative or courtroom setting. What makes this case more complicated is the reported presence of more than one contributor in the DNA mixture. That means investigators are not dealing with a clean profile. They are dealing with overlapping genetic information. In practical terms, that slows everything down. Because before you can even begin identifying someone, you have to separate what belongs to who. And until that happens, the evidence remains incomplete. But incomplete does not mean unimportant. It means unresolved. And unresolved evidence still guides investigations. It shapes where detectives look next. It determines what questions they ask. It influences whether they return to certain locations or individuals for further analysis. And in this case, it appears to be part of a much larger investigative effort that also includes behavioral analysis, surveillance review, and geographic follow-ups like the Rio Rico operation. When you step back and look at everything together, a pattern begins to form. The front porch behavior, the rear door conditions, the lack of clear internal struggle, the controlled access points, the DNA mixture, the forensic hair sample. Each piece on its own raises questions. But together, they begin to suggest that investigators are not looking at a simple, single-moment incident. They are looking at something that may have involved movement, planning, and interaction across more than one point in time or space. That is what makes forensic evidence like this so important. It doesn't just explain what happened. It helps reconstruct how it might have happened. And in cases where the physical scene leaves gaps, DNA often becomes the quiet bridge between what is known and what is still missing. At this stage, investigators are not just asking who was there. They are asking how many people were there, and whether the answers are hidden in the layers of evidence still being processed. Because somewhere inside those layers, there may be a profile forming. Slowly, carefully, waiting for the moment when science finally catches up to the story the evidence is trying to tell. At this stage of the investigation, nothing is viewed in isolation anymore. Not the porch, not the back doors, not the surveillance footage, not even the DNA. Everything is connected. And when investigators start connecting those points, the picture becomes harder to ignore. Because one by one, the details begin to repeat the same idea. Control. The front porch shows a person who did not rush in blindly. Someone who positioned themselves carefully. Someone who waited for a response instead of forcing immediate entry. The back of the house shows something else. Reported signs of doors being propped open, not broken. Access points seemingly managed rather than destroyed. A space that feels maintained during the incident, not disrupted. Inside the home, there is no widely reported chaotic struggle that moves through every room. No clear trail of destruction that would normally suggest a violent intrusion deep inside the house. And outside, at the front, the most significant physical evidence is concentrated near the threshold. The transition point between outside and inside. When you place those details side by side, a pattern starts to form that investigators cannot ignore. This does not look like a random break-in driven by panic or opportunity. It looks like something structured around movement, around timing, around expectation. And that brings the focus back to something behavioral experts have repeatedly emphasized in discussions of similar cases. Familiarity. Because control over a space does not always come from force. Sometimes it comes from knowledge. Knowing where to stand. Knowing how someone inside the house is likely to respond. Knowing the layout well enough to move through it without hesitation. Even the smallest details begin to matter under that lens. The reported use of items from the property itself, like flower pots in the garden area, to maintain door positions. That detail suggests not just access but comfort within the environment. The ability to interact with the space as if it was not unfamiliar. And that is where the interpretation becomes more unsettling. Because if someone can move through a property at night with that level of ease, it suggests they are not learning the environment in real time. They already understand it. When investigators combine that with the behavioral analysis of the person at the front door, calm, patient, positioned, and not immediately forced into action, it creates a consistent profile. Not of randomness, but of someone operating with intent. Possibly someone who expected a reaction. Possibly someone who understood how Nancy Guthrie might respond in a quiet home, in a quiet neighborhood, during a predictable routine. And then there is the forensic layer. The DNA mixture. The rootless hair. The ongoing laboratory work that suggests investigators are not dealing with a single clean answer, but a layered set of biological clues that still need to be separated and understood. When you combine behavioral evidence with physical evidence, investigators begin to narrow the field of possibility. And what begins to emerge is not a specific name. Not yet. But a type. A profile. Someone who was either close enough to observe patterns, or close enough to enter the space without being treated like an outsider. Someone who did not appear to struggle against the environment, but to move through it with a level of understanding that feels difficult to explain if they had never been there before. This is why the focus of the investigation keeps tightening. Because every layer added does not introduce chaos. It introduces consistency. And consistency in cases like this is often more revealing than noise. At this point, investigators are not just asking what happened that night. They are asking how many pieces of the environment were already familiar to the person responsible. Because the more familiar the pattern becomes, the smaller the list of possibilities gets. And that is where the investigation begins to point in a direction that is no longer broad, but increasingly specific. Not toward a random intruder, but toward someone whose connection to the environment may explain too many of the details to ignore. As the investigation continues, one thing has become clear. This case is not standing still. Even when the public hears nothing new for days or weeks, behind the scenes the work continues, quiet, slow, and methodical. For investigators, this is often the hardest stage, because it is the stage where everything depends on evidence that is still being processed, DNA still being analyzed, statements still being reviewed, footage still being studied frame by frame, leads still being followed in different directions. And in cases like Nancy Guthrie's, that means the truth is not gone. It is just not fully visible yet. The forensic work being done in laboratories like Quantico is not fast, but it is persistent. Even small fragments of biological evidence can take time to fully interpret, especially when multiple contributors are involved or when samples are degraded. But time in cases like this cuts both ways, because while science is catching up, memories fade, witnesses hesitate, people move on with their lives, and silence can sometimes become a shield for whoever understands what really happened. That is why investigators continue to emphasize one key message in cases like this: information matters. Even the smallest detail can change the direction of an entire investigation. A memory, a name, a sighting, a moment someone didn't think was important at the time. And now, months into this case, those details are still being sought. Because somewhere, there may be a person who saw something they did not realize mattered. Or someone who knows more than they have ever said out loud. What makes this case linger is not just the unanswered questions. It is the way the evidence keeps pointing back to the idea that this was not random, that there was structure to it, movement that made sense to someone who understood the space, and behavior that suggests familiarity, not confusion. But until investigators confirm those conclusions publicly, the case remains open, still active, still moving, still waiting for the moment when everything finally aligns. And when that moment comes, it will likely not be because of speculation. It will be because of evidence finally speaking clearly enough to be undeniable. Until then, the story remains unfinished. If you've been following this case, make sure to subscribe for more updates as new details emerge in real time. And now I want to hear from you. What do you think really happened inside that hole? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Because sometimes, the most important insights don't come from investigators alone. They come from people watching closely enough to notice what others missed.